By the spring of 1945, the Allied armies had done what once seemed impossible. They had crossed the Rhine, shattered the Third Reich, and driven Nazi Germany to the edge of collapse. Victory in Europe was no longer a matter of doubt. It was only a matter of days. But for the men who commanded those armies, the most dangerous decisions were still ahead. The end of the war would not be decided by the final bullets fired, but by where armies stood when the guns fell silent, and by which flags flew over which cities at the moment peace began. The commanders at the top understood this. They knew that geography would harden into politics, and that politics would harden into the post-war world. Nowhere was that reality clearer than in Austria in May 1945. What unfolded there was not a story of battlefield heroics or dramatic last stands. It was something quieter and far more consequential. It was a test of command, restraint, and alliance discipline at the very moment when unity mattered most and temptation was greatest. This is not a tale of rogue generals or stolen victories. It is the story of how close the Allies came to turning victory into confrontation before the war was even over. The alliance at its breaking point by early May, the Grand Alliance had achieved its purpose. Germany was collapsing. Hitler was dead. Resistance was crumbling on every front. Yet the alliance that had destroyed Nazi Germany was never built on trust. It was built on necessity. The United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union shared a common enemy, but little else. Each power carried a fundamentally different vision of Europe's future. Those differences had been managed during the war through compromise, delay, and carefully worded agreements. But now, with the enemy nearly defeated, those compromises were being tested. At conferences like Yalta, the Allies had agreed, at least on paper, on occupation zones and stopping lines. These were meant to prevent accidental clashes between Allied armies and to ensure that victory did not collapse into chaos. Austria occupied a particularly sensitive place in those plans. Unlike Germany, Austria was officially treated as a liberated country, the first victim of Nazi aggression, annexed in 1938. It was to be divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Vienna would be jointly occupied, just as Berlin would be in Germany. But unlike Berlin, Austria's boundaries were not clearly fixed as Allied armies closed in. Maps were provisional, stop lines were theoretical, and the battlefield was moving faster than diplomacy. Armies on a collision course. American forces were advancing east from Bavaria. Soviet armies were pushing west from Hungary and Czechoslovakia. British troops were moving north from Italy. Each carried orders, each carried maps, and each understood that once ground was taken, it became leverage. Those stop lines, meant to prevent conflict, were not just military instructions. They were political tripwires. Cross one without permission, and the consequences would not be measured in casualties, but in trust. At the center of this fragile balance stood the supreme Allied commander. His authority was military, but his responsibility was political. Every move he approved or failed to stop would echo far beyond the battlefield. And then, one of his most aggressive commanders reached the edge of Austria. The advance into Upper Austria. The U.S. Third Army had swept across southern Germany with speed and force. By early May, its forward units were at the Austrian border. Ahead lay Upper Austria and the city of Linz. Linz was not just another town. It was a major industrial center, sitting astride the Danube. Under Allied agreements, It was slated for Soviet occupation. The American stop line lay well to the west, but the situation on the ground was changing by the hour. German units were disintegrating. Civilians and soldiers alike were fleeing westward, desperate to surrender to American forces rather than fall into Soviet hands. Intelligence reports suggested Soviet units were still days away, slowed by logistics and the burden of consolidating Vienna. From a purely military perspective, the logic was clear. American forces could take Linz immediately. They could restore order, secure infrastructure, and control the collapse before chaos set in. Politically, however, the implications were explosive. The advance went forward, not as an open act of defiance, but not with explicit permission either. Units crossed the provisional stop line under the justification of pursuit and stabilization. By the time headquarters fully grasped what had happened, American troops were already in Linz. The facts were on the ground. The boundary had been crossed. What followed was not a battlefield crisis, but a command crisis. Eisenhower's dilemma. The Supreme Commander now faced a decision with no perfect outcome. He could order an immediate withdrawal. That would demonstrate good faith and reassure the Soviets that agreements still mattered. But it would also mean handing over territory and tens of thousands of prisoners and civilians to Soviet control. Many of them feared what would follow. It would also send a signal to American commanders everywhere. Initiative would be punished when it conflicted with politics. The alternative was to endorse the advance. That would strengthen the American position and create leverage for negotiation. But it would confirm Soviet suspicions that the Western Allies intended to bend or break agreements whenever it suited them. At a moment when cooperation was still needed, especially with the war against Japan ongoing, such a rupture could have consequences far beyond Austria. The decision could not be made in isolation. Washington was watching. London was watching. Moscow was watching. And so were the men in the field. What followed was neither retreat nor confrontation. It was restraint. Leverage without rupture. No public endorsement was issued. No immediate withdrawal was ordered. Instead, the situation was allowed to stabilize, while diplomatic channels moved quietly into action. The American presence in Linz became leverage, not provocation. The Soviets protested, but they did not escalate. They understood that the alliance still served their interests, and that a rupture now would be premature. Negotiations followed, access routes, occupation procedures, coordination in Vienna, the handling of displaced persons. The American position on the ground gave weight to those discussions, and when the withdrawal came, it came deliberately. After terms were clarified and interests protected, the alliance held, barely. Command. In a political war, no public reprimand followed. No dramatic showdown occurred. The advance was treated not as insubordination, but as an operational overreach absorbed quietly into alliance management. This was not weakness. It was command discipline at the highest level. The war in Europe was ending, but the peace was already becoming political. Victory required restraint as much as force. The decisions made in Austria did not prevent the Cold War. Nothing could. But they established a pattern that would define the years ahead. Pressure without rupture, leverage without war, restraint without surrender. The first shadow of the Cold War Austria, in May 1945, was a preview. A moment when allies tested boundaries, not with tanks, but with presence. A reminder that victory creates new conflicts, even as it ends old ones, and a demonstration that leadership at the end of war is often quieter, harder, and less visible than leadership in battle. The burden of victory. When the war in Europe officially ended, the guns fell silent, but the consequences of command did not. The story of Linz is not about defiance. It is about judgment. It is about understanding when to advance and when to stop. And it is a reminder that the most important decisions of war are sometimes the ones that prevent the next war from starting too soon.